All right, thank you and welcome everyone to the first EDIC Lunch and Learn for 2019, which is very exciting. So today we have with us Nora Yotsov, and she is with disaster management, and she's been with the county since 2002. So we're very glad to have you here and talking about this topic with us today. And just a really quick reminder, if you did not sign in, we have a sign-in sheet up at the front. And also it's really awesome when we get those surveys back at the end. So if you can remember to take a few minutes at the end to fill those out, we'd really appreciate it. So with that, turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, if you don't, just raise your hand and just let me know because I can't really hear it that well up here. And I do have a weird voice. I tend to get very quiet, so please just let me know if you can't hear me. How many of you have contacts in Cuba or are familiar with Cuba or? Yay, Jackie. All right. Well, I hope that this will be like a really good opportunity to learn a little about this country. It's something that we don't have access to coming from the United States and something that my husband and I, it's my husband Scott, by the way, right over here. We went together in July of 2018. It's something that we've been interested in exploring for many, many years. Personally for me, because it's a communist country, and I'm always fascinated by these types of countries, having grown up in one. But second, because it exists in this Caribbean area that is so contrary to the political structure that they exist in, and in addition, our really contentious relationship with Cuba. So we wanted to explore that on the personal level, but also on the professional level. I'm really interested in what Cuba's doing with disaster management and what they're really doing to protect their people with the very limited resources they have. So this presentation, we're going to mix in a bunch of information. It's really important that I talk to you, I think, a little bit about the history, so I'm going to just do a really high-level overview of the history of Cuba, just to get a little understanding of how complex it is. Then we'll talk about Cuba today, what is going on today. We're going to look at that through an equity lens and look at some gender issues, LGBTQ issues, and access and functional needs issues, and then I'll move on to what they do with disaster management. So if you have any questions, you can either write them down and we can talk later, or you can email me anytime. I should be done in plenty of time, but if for some reason I'm not, and you don't have time for questions afterwards, I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards because I just love this country. We had a really good time there, so I really hope that this will spark a little bit of interest or passion in you about the people in Cuba. So here's a layout of what it looks like. It's the biggest island in the Caribbean, and it's only 90 miles from Miami, so it's very close to the US. We initially went to Havana for a conference. It was a disaster management conference, the 10th of its kind. And then we traveled by plane to Baracoa, which is Guantanamo province. It's just a few miles from Guantanamo Bay, which is infamous. But we didn't go there. And then from then on, we traveled by a 6-hour cab ride through the mountains to Gibara, which is where the first Portuguese landed in Cuba when they started exploring. Baracoa was actually the first settlement in Cuba. That was where the first Spanish colony was formed. And then Holguin back to Havana on the way back. We almost became permanent residents in Cuba as well because we almost got stuck in Holguin. So that's kind of where we explored. It's not the whole island, and there's a lot more to explore there, but we'll talk about our experience in those locations. So again, in order to really understand how unique Cuba is, I want to go through a real quick series of history so you can get a sense of what we have. So very similar to the US, you have Columbus. He landed in Cuba in 1492 and discovered it. There were already Taino and Siboney native peoples there. The Taino was the main group of natives there, but as we all know with colonization, he discovered it. By 1511, Diego Velazquez formed the first colony, and that was in Baracoa, all the way on the other side of the island. So that town's been in existence since 1511, which is pretty amazing. And it didn't take long for them to start importing slaves from Africa, as many colonies did. But it did take them about 360 years to abolish slavery, and abolish legally, but there's still quite a bit of modern day slavery that goes on over there. The U.S. started seeing Cuba as a good resource. Its strategic location to the Panama Canal, of course, a lot of sugarcane. Access to sugarcane was great. So they started helping out with the Spanish-American War, the first one, in the late 1800s, and they started blaming Spaniards and vice versa, the blame game, and they started fighting over the land. Finally, in the Second War of Independence, the U.S. was a major player in this to help Cuba get out of Spanish colonial rule. But it wasn't until 1902 with the Platt Amendment that the U.S. gave Cuba independence, and by that meaning that there were many conditions such as the U.S. can enter Cuba at any time. They had a permanent presence there. They couldn't incur any foreign debt without going through the U.S., and a lot of different regulations that really kept a stronghold on the island. There was a lot of interest for the U.S. to stay in Cuba, so while they finally gained independence from Spain, they were still very much under control of the U.S. It wasn't until 1934 that the Treaty of Relations finally released a little bit of those controls, but it gave them permanent ownership or permanent ability to be in Guantanamo Bay, which was a way to protect the Panama Canal. So we've been in there officially since that time, and interestingly enough, the rent during the Castro rule was, it initially started at 400 something a month, or a year. And from what we understand is Castro never cashed a check. They kept the checks in a safe. Current rent to stay in Guantanamo Bay is $4,000 a year, which the U.S. continues to pay. I don't know if the checks are cashed or not, but all power has been cut off, and it's a self-sufficient area of Cuba that has no contact, that's completely sovereign from the rest of the island. They went through a series of very poor leadership, a lot of dictators going on. And in 1952, Fulgencio Batista was probably the most well-known of those. They went through multiple revolutions. He canceled election after a coup and became dictator. He's very closely aligned with the U.S. We had very good relations with the U.S. Cuba was a travel destination. This is the era of the casinos. Meyer Lansky with the mob set up a bunch of casinos there, and there was a lot of money coming into Cuba. The relationships were great, but the money wasn't going to everybody. Money was going to the people in power, and there was a lot of society and stress going on around that time. So during this time, the Castro brothers started really looking at ways to overthrow, and after multiple attempts, they finally overthrew on December 30th of 1958. This was known as the Ragtag Revolution, which occurred when they came into a few main towns, and basically Batista's men just laid down their guns and said, go ahead and take it. So it was not an expected revolution, but it changed, obviously, the course of history of Cuba, because now you have a socialist. Castro never identified as a communist initially. He was very much a socialist. He saw the inequity that was going on with the wealth and the disparity of how the average person was treated. And so he wanted to change that. So what they did in 1959 is they took all the American corporations and excorporated them. So they took over all the business, all the industry, everything. And the state started running this, and they gave land back to the population. This led to a lot of unease in the U.S. because now we were closely aligned, and now all of a sudden we had this big gap, and our relationships really faltered. Led to the Bay of Pigs, which is an attempt to assassinate Castro, one of the well-known attempts, ultimately leading to the trade embargo, which has been an economic issue for Cuba for since. By 1962, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was Kennedy and Khrushchev standing off. We almost had a nuclear war in 1962. In response to our missile sites in Turkey and Italy, Russia had built, the Soviet Union back then, had built missile sites in Cuba. And so there was a standoff where tense few days until Khrushchev backed off, we had quite a bit of issue that could have caused into a major war. By 1967, Che Guevara was assassinated in Bolivia. And throughout this time, Cuba had increasingly aligned themselves with the Soviet Union and went from socialist to a communist outlook. And so when the Soviet Union fell in 1989, Cuba lost pretty much all of their resources, all their connections, their economic support, and they fell into this downturn called the Special Period. They haven't really come out of that yet. They've actually been struggling ever since then to come out of it. Some of you may remember Elian Gonzalez. He was the little Cuban boy that came to the U.S. With his mom. His mom passed away, and he was staying with family. And through a court order, they raided and took him and delivered him back to his dad in Cuba. That was a political nightmare for us, and something that we have, to deal with since, which continued to make our relationship with Cuba contentious. It wasn't until 2008, so 40 years later, that Fidel finally, as he started aging, he gave power over to his little brother Raul Castro, which kept the party line going and no problems with the way they worked the country. In 2014, Obama started having talks with Raul Castro, and they talked about normalizing relationships. In 2015, they started talking about reducing the embargo, but by 2017, that had all reverted back. So we're still in the same situation that we have been with Cuba for the past 60 years. And then at 2018, just last year, Raul Castro stepped down, and the new president is Miguel Diaz-Canel. He's a party member, so there's little known about how he's going to respond to the situation in Cuba and how he's going to advance people. So this kind of gives you an idea of where we're at today with Cuba, politically, historically, but I want to talk about what the country is like, what we saw when we traveled there. So this has a lot of words. I have to apologize, but I'll go through it. They're considered a developing country. They rank about midway in the development index. They're at 73. The U.S. is 13, and Niger is like 140, something there at the bottom. So just to give you an idea, they're halfway on the Human Development Index. There's just a little over 11 million people in the country, so it's not large, but it's a good-sized country. They are a communist government, and their GDP is quite low considering what we have here. So about 6,000 per capita is the income, and 69 billion. Okay. So in 1959, when the Castros took over, they confiscated cars, they took over all the businesses, and so up until 2011, they were not allowed to import any cars. They don't have a car-making facility in Cuba, so that's why you see such lovely cars there. And it's really interesting to see the mix of cars now that they've started allowing other cars to come in. It wasn't until 10 years ago that they had cell phones. So this is something that's still fairly new to them. And Wi-Fi, nobody has Wi-Fi at home. There's just hotspots run by the government, and you have to buy these cards to get time on the Wi-Fi. They're finally in talks about getting Wi-Fi on cell phones, which is going to be a whole game changer, I think, for them. The demographics are quite hard to really establish. They have a mix of black, white, and native, but depending on what study you look at, it'll be a 65% ratio, black to white. They vary, so it was really hard to determine, but the majority is European with African and some native. They do have an extremely high literacy rate, and that's because they have compulsory education. That's a communist aspect of that. Everybody has to go to school between 6 and 15, and that's fully government funded and supported. They do have the highest doctor to patient ratio in the world, but a caveat to that is facilities, resources, medication, and specialty equipment is what's lacking. So while they have a lot of trained people, they do lack a lot of the resources to fully have a good program. And the majority, more than half of their economy, goes to education and healthcare, which I would love to see the U.S. do more than half of the economy dedicated to health and education. That says a lot, but that doesn't mean that they're in an amazing place. So let's take a look through an equity lens at what it really looks like. According to the UN, they're in the top 20 nations for development, specifically Goal 3, which is gender equality, access to healthcare and education for women, in the nations for progress. So that doesn't mean they're starting out high, but they're actually advancing. They do have a top-down law that's mandated for women to have access to education and healthcare and to the workforce. But in reality, they have issues still with a lot of gender bias, a lot of machismo. Just because women get access to education doesn't mean that they get treated the same way and doesn't mean they get the same job opportunities. So while they support this from the top down, there's still a lot of issues that they need to address. 38% of the women make up the workforce, but more than 40% are still unemployed. So that's something that needs to be rectified. And even worse is, on average, women earn less than half of men. So that is something institutional that they have yet to address and still work on. There's progress. And again, part of the UN development goals is they are one of the top nations for progress on this. Privatization with the restaurants and the Airbnbs has helped provide more opportunity, but because it's private, not government run, it creates less protection for the women. And I thought this was really interesting. This is the World Bank's global rankings for gender equality for 2017. So this is only a little over a year old. And Cuba ranks 25th for women for educational attainment, health, and political empowerment, whereas the US ranks 49. I thought that was very interesting worldwide. So Iceland is first. So I thought that was interesting. So I'm not sure how the numbers end up and how it's reported or how it gets skewed, but the World Economic Forum is a fairly reliable source. And I just thought that's something to note. For LGBTQ, they've had a horrible history. During the Castro administration in the 60s, they had this labor camps called the UMAPs. And they were basically anybody that was a political dissident, a religious dissident, anybody that was a criminal, or anybody that was identified as LGBTQ, they were sent to these work camps. They had about 300,000 people go through them until the late 60s, until they were put down. And they estimate about 800 of those were included in that. But since the 1990s, Mariela Castro, who is Raul Castro's daughter, started up a National Center for Sex Education, and that has gained momentum throughout the country. They hold a Pride Parade every year in Havana, and it's grown. They recognize International Day Against Homophobia, so there's a lot of efforts from the ground up that are really starting to take hold, and people are starting to change their opinion, and this is probably the biggest part of it. This new president, just in September of last year, talked about supporting same-sex marriage, which I thought, holy cow, this is amazing. This was in September. By December, they had taken out the Article 68, from the proposed Constitution. And initially, there was a lot of uproar, thinking, okay, what's happening? Why did they take it out? But according to Mariela Castro, and I'm going to have to read this because I don't really speak Spanish. I say a few words, and I just can't speak it. I tried. They've reformulated under Article 82, and here's a tweet from her justifying that. The new language embodies the essence of the article previously proposed, 68, as it erases the gender binarism and heterosexuality that defined marriage under the 1976 Constitution. So according to Mariela Castro, they're actually moving beyond gender identification entirely, and this is a really good thing. So the Constitution is set to be voted on the 24th of February. So it would be interesting to see how it goes, but currently in their new Constitution, they're going to look at allowing this, and I think that's pretty far in advance. Humanity and Inclusion is a nonprofit aid organization that works in war-torn countries. They work in poverty, they work in exclusion, and they're one of the few organizations that are allowed to work in Cuba, in addition to the United Nations Development Program and Oxfam. They've been there since 1998, and they estimate, which I have a hard time, I guess it depends on the description of what those with disabilities and access and functional needs are, but the population with disabilities and access functional needs is at 367,000. That's only 4% of the population, which is, in my opinion, really, really low, but it may be a much more restricted definition. They do provide free medical care, but they have issues again with transportation, with specialized equipment, and those that require the assistance to access that information. They help with prosthesis, and their community-based rehabilitation project is really interesting. It helps not just the people in need, those with disabilities, but it also helps practitioners that deal with them to understand and learn how to deal with those folks, especially those that may have other impairments that may not be physically noticeable. So that's a great educational project that they've been doing throughout the country to help with that. Socioeconomic inclusion, they do a lot of training and occupational options for those that need a little bit of extra help, and they've been very successful with that. They've had 240,000 people go through that program at last count. And they focus on disaster risk management for those vulnerable people. So those with disabilities, women, those that are really poverty stricken, they have disaster risk management programs for them to help them get up to speed, which I think is pretty awesome. One of the big things, if you don't know, is ever since the special period, even before the special period during the Castro's rule, they've had issues with food security. And something that you see at stores is a lot of empty shelves, except for when the imports come in. You'll see a lot of the same product lining the shelves. We experienced this in Havana, and it's an issue that's only become worse through tourism, because what happens is it takes all of the available food and it gets funneled into the restaurants and the ability to feed the tourists, and the per calorie rate consumption for the average Cuban is extremely low, actually varying on malnourishment. But just to give you an idea, when the shipments do come in, you'll see a lot of that product. This is a product of hot dogs that had come into a shipment. Scott and I managed to take some pictures of that. So whatever is available is what they have. The country cannot supply the ability to feed everybody, the 11 million people on there at the way that they're doing. So they rely on imports quite a bit. Here's kind of what the pallets look like that come in. Their main import partners are, and I have to look at the numbers here to give an idea what it is. So they get mainly imports from China, Spain, Russia, Venezuela, and Mexico. Those are their main import partners that provide them with a lot of relief. Their import is 10.9 billion a year. Their export is 2.6 billion a year, so they have an 8.3 billion a year deficit, which is a huge issue for Cuba and something that they need to figure out how to overcome. And last but not least today, where Cuba is before I get into our conference and what we observed as Scott and I went through, is what kind of hazards they have. Well, Cuba has been on the front line in the Caribbean. Their two main hazards are climate driven. So the first one is sea level rise, and it's not just sea level rise with saltwater intrusion and loss of land, but it's storm surges and a variety of other issues that happens with sea level rise. And then their other main one is hurricanes, again, strengthening because of climate change. And this is just an overlay of a couple of 160 years of hurricanes that you can see. I wish I had a newer map because there's probably a few more on there, but those are the hazards they face. And with very little infrastructure and very little ability to overcome, they have a very clear understanding of the risks. So I'll talk about programs a little bit about how they address that. But aside all this, I want to show you just a few pictures. These are my tourist pictures from Havana, just to see how beautiful it really is. This is from old Havana. Very colorful. a lot of old infrastructure, a lot of people very friendly. Their favorite question every time they saw us, people, where are you from? Where are you from? They always want to know where you're from. Just a few pictures of what Havana looks like. A lot of new, beautiful infrastructure, a lot of preserved old infrastructure. Just stunning. Some of it decaying, some of it not. I do want to point out here, we saw a lot of these folks in white. They're the Santeria belief. It's a belief that came from West Africa that came in with the slaves. And the Catholic religion is the main religion in Cuba, but they have allowed them to exist as a social club. They don't recognize it as a religion, it's a social club, but it's kind of interesting to see, and they always have white umbrellas and wear all white, and they do interesting things like animal sacrifices and talk to spirits and all that kind of stuff, but fascinating culture. The malecon, which is a walkway here, every town on the waterfront has it. In Havana, it's fun. Everybody's there, all, comes out at night and hangs out. But it's their protection mechanism. There's a lot of propaganda everywhere. And then, of course, because we're Timbers fans, we had to scarf our friends that we had made that are in the art world that we connected with through my husband's work. So it's their little son, and we scarfed them. Not that they could probably ever wear this wool scarf in the summertime because the temperatures are pretty warm. But so that's the history, where kind of an idea of where Cuba's at today. And then I'm going to briefly go over the Congress that I went to, and then the two towns that we went to and what they are doing specifically related to disaster management. So this is moving on to the disaster side of it. So this was the conference. The main reason why I wanted to go there is they have this strategic plan for the entire country called the Tarea Vida, which is Life Task, and it's their climate change strategy on how to protect the country from impacts from climate change. For them, it's not a political issue, it's a real issue. And so I was really interested in hearing about that and did find out quite a bit about that. One of the main topics on the conference was climate change as well. They have they had to upgrade flooding classifications. They have done quite a bit on mangroves and other kind of natural barrier projects. They have a lot of issues with drought in parts of the country, and then the detailed report, the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report with the specific Cuba forecast. Another big topic, food security, because it creates disasters all day long, and they're doing a lot of different things with a variety of different crops and farming practices. Russia had built a regional training center for the Caribbean in Cuba, so there's a tour for that. Venezuela and a bunch of other countries use that. And then Oxfam and UNDP had their programs that they discussed, and then another huge part, the last 2 days, were really health-related issues, not just human, but also animal health-related issues, and a lot of different programs that they have going on. So it was a very full agenda. It was a fascinating conference. Everybody that was from Cuba had some sort of a quote from Castro on their presentation. I think that's just a customary thing to do. You can tell the foreigners we didn't have any quotes from Castro on our presentations. Anyways, interesting. So, Tarea Vida, which is their life task or their life project. What is it? This is developed by the Ministry of Science and Technology and Environment. SITMA is what they're called, and they are in charge of this program for the entire country. It was finally approved in April 25th of 2017. It's extremely comprehensive, but it really was born out of an idea from Castro from the early 90s. They've been thinking about how climate impacts their country for quite a long time, and they've been seeing the impacts, and they've been working with them. So it took them really quite a long time to get to this point where they have this far outreaching strategy and where they can move forward. It has three components to it: the short term, which is the immediate, we need to fix this stuff now, long term and long range. So the plan goes through 2100. And the 5 strategic action, 11 projects, these are the 11 projects listed here. I won't go into them. I'll just briefly talk about the strategic actions, but the main part I'll show you is the map with the 73 different locations that they have identified as goals. This is very word heavy, so I'll just do the brief. Please don't try to read all of it. So number one is reducing the population along the coast. That's one of their biggest hazards. So that's the top strategy. Any infrastructure that's along the coast, adapting that to erosion and flooding. Agricultural activities and crop diversification are 3 and 4. And then urban reordering, which is extremely interesting, and I would be curious to see in 2100, I won't be here, but be curious to see how they achieve this, because they're really talking about reorganizing the whole country as a whole to be more protected and better infrastructure. And reordering settlements, cultural issues, and you've got emotional issues, and you've got livelihood issues, you've got a lot of issues to deal with. And so this is a very, very lofty action to partake, but when I show you what they've done in one town alone, just in 2018, it may be possible. Here's the map, and it's hard to see, but basically the green dot is there's no impact from climate change. You can see there's 2 from the areas that they studied. The yellow are partial impact by 2100. So there's still areas of concern, but they know they're being impacted, but they're not the top priority. The red, and hopefully the red comes out okay, is total damage by 2050, and the pink is total damage by 2100. So they do have quite a few areas that they're looking at completely going away, and there's populations in those areas. So they're trying to figure out ways to protect that population, preserve culture, and make sure that they meet everybody's needs. The areas that we were looking at are really quite over here, so they're not much as far as potential impact compared to other parts of the country. But I'll go over what they've done so far. So what do they do to prepare, and how do they make sure that everybody's on board? We have this in our work. My goal in disaster management is to train and exercise and make sure that people, our first responders or stakeholders, are all prepared and aware. Something that they have gotten together on as a nation is risk perception. So there's buy-in at the top about the risks that the country faces. They don't have to deny just because they don't have a storm maybe this year doesn't mean that they won't have 2 next year. So there's buy-in at the top, and it's in the form of congressional mandates as well. There is an agreement on risk. So even though they understand that this climate change issue is a global issue, they understand that it's not lateral. It doesn't impact everybody in the same way. So they regionally categorize the risk. As you saw on the map, it talks specifically what those regions face. It's supported by the United Nations Development Program, and they've established regional risk management centers to work locally on those local issues. And it's tied to the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So it has support from the UN as well, which is a good thing for them because they require a lot of support from the UN to function. They also have public education at all levels. As long with mandated education, they have a curriculum all the way from way early in elementary school all the way through college, which talks about their hazards. They do community outreach programs, and then the government leads that program. In addition to just learning about it, we know that the main way for people to actually understand their risk is to practice and train. So since 32 years, they've been doing an annual 2-day drill. It's a full-scale drill that they conduct in May. This gets them ready for the hurricane season that starts in June, and everybody's required to participate. So the whole country trains for 2 days every May. So it's built into their memory. It's built into just their life. INSMET is their meteorology department. They have an office in every province and some of the smaller municipalities that are harder hit. They monitor 24/7, just like our weather service does as well. They have a very detailed early warning system and alert system that they do. So they have a 5-day before a hurricane is forecasted to come. They do certain measures 3 days before, 2 days before, and then 1 day before. So they're very set. People understand what these are. Hurricane season is half of the year, June 1st through November 30th. And INSMET is actually a leader in the World Meteorological Organization. So They have a pretty high standing. They're very advanced. But how does this translate into what Cuba, the promises that they make? So I have two different sources on here. I couldn't find a combined source. So in this 10-year period, they had a total of 14 hurricanes, 20 tropical storms. They evacuated basically the whole country throughout those different events. 1 million homes were destroyed, and 18 billion impact doesn't seem like a lot for us, but for them it's quite a bit. And they've only had 35 fatalities during those hurricanes. When we talk about Hurricane Matthew and Harvey and Florence and all those, in 10 years with 14 hurricanes, 35 fatalities is pretty low. Another source, this is the Civil Defense Magazine. This is the top 10 hurricanes from 2001 to 2017. And the fatality totals are here. These are zeros here. So Hurricane Matthew, they had 0 direct fatalities. I'll talk about the 4 that they had indirect later, but they had 0 there. Hurricane Ike, they had 7 fatalities total in that country, and that was the costliest hurricane for them. So, response. These are the 2 towns we went into. Gibara is known as the town that time forgot. Basically, it stands still in time. Hurricane Ike hit in Gibara in September of 2008, so it was 10 years before. We couldn't really see much as far as recovery goes on. But the significance is it followed 45 days of straight rain. So it was already waterlogged, everything was flooded already. And when it hit, they had to evacuate the entire town. And you'll understand why the entire town had to be evacuated once you see the layout of the town. It's a very interesting town. The inundation from the storm surge was 15 to 20 feet high, which swept through the 200 meters inland, which again you'll see in a little bit. It devastated their crops, so everything that rely on to survive. It damaged 300,000 homes in Cuba. 43,000 were total loss, but most of those were in Gibara. And Gibara's got a population of about 70,000, the region, so you have multi-generational housing in Gibara. What that really means is a lot of these houses, the majority of the houses were destroyed in that town. There was 1 fatality, not in the town, but in the region, because this guy was trying to save his animals, his farm animals, and he drowned. But as far as the actual hurricane impact, nobody died. Here, I don't know if I could play this video from here. I may have to click on it, sorry. Can you click on the picture? Show you a quick video of what it looked like. Maybe not so quick.
Una estela de destrozos dejó el huracán Ike a su paso por la Villa Blanca de los Cangrejos. Gibara ya no es la misma. Aún se cuantifican los daños al fondo habitacional y a los recursos económicos del territorio, pero su severidad es evidente. El mar penetró ciudad adentro hasta unos 200 metros y arrastró consigo todo lo que encontró a su paso. Numerosas zonas del malecón colapsaron y lo mismo ocurrió con los viales de la ciudad. Las afectaciones eléctricas son considerables y en estos momentos no es posible la comunicación telefónica con el municipio. Se reportan grandes destrozos en el astillero y en los almacenes industriales y una parte de la población recupera lo poco que ha quedado de sus viviendas. Por eso ya se trabaja en la Villa Blanca de los Cangrejos. Ahora los jibareños han de enfrentar con celeridad el reto que la naturaleza nos ha impuesto a los cubanos. Desde Gibara, Holguín, fue un reporte de Alfredo Claro y Abdiel Bermúdez, Sistema Informativo de la Televisión Cubana.
There's going to be one more video, I'm sorry. So this is what Gibara looks like. The majority of the town lies right here, just a few feet above sea level. It's beautiful. But they have this advantage. One of the roads leads actually up a big steep hill like this. It's stairs. There's no elevator, escalator. And then there's a few dirt roads that kind of go up in this hill. But the beauty that they have is they have this cave system all around here. And so in order to evacuate this entire town, they evacuate to the caves typically in Cuba, their first evacuation source is a safe home that's a family or friend, and everybody knows which ones are deemed safe and which ones aren't. The second choice is a shelter, a public shelter. They don't have a lot of shelters around. They don't have the capacity. But for this town, their first choice is a cave. If you can click on it, it's just a quick second. Hopefully it'll play. It's kind of what the cave system looks like. It's pretty up there. You can go down in it. They didn't. They just had to go. But it's
Like a
protected
hotel lobby.
as far as, and that's it. Protected as far as sheltering them from the storm surge because there's a lot of covered ground. So, so that's their solution. I mean, that's a pretty ingenious solution if you ask me. Just some pictures of Gibara and the construction. A lot of these homes, as you can see, have withstood storms. A lot of these homes are barely hanging on. Again, multi-generational housing. But the way that they've been built, they've been living with storms for a very long time. And you can see the damage. It used to be the white town. It's very, very little white left in it anymore. But you can see new hope and new construction going in. So back to Tarea Vida, which is the life task, their climate change strategy. In just this one town alone, in 2018 alone, just last year, they removed 15 homes. They moved the elementary school to a safe ground. They've moved the hospital. They've planted, they've made a new road linking this settlement before that was not connected with an actual road in order to help them evacuate because they don't have high ground like Gibara does. And they've planted a bunch of natural protection barriers. That's one little tiny town in Cuba, 1 year of the strategy. I think it's pretty amazing, you know, given what little they have. I think I'm very impressed at what they've done. The last thing we're going to look at is we went to Baracoa, and we went there a year after Hurricane Matthew hit. And so this is their recovery efforts, and this is what we could see, because we were only there a year and a half after it happened, so we could actually see what was going on. Matthew for Cuba was the second costliest hurricane after Ike. It occurred October 4th of 2016. They had notice on October 1st, and by October 2nd, they had notice to evacuate. The evacuations were over 1 million. It damaged 24,000 homes in Baracoa alone. Baracoa has about 83,000 people in the province itself. The town has a little bit less. So it impacted, long-term impacted about a quarter of their residents, a third of their residents. There were 0 fatalities. Caveat on the fatalities. In November, a little over a month after the hurricane, there were 4 people driving in a car on a bridge that collapsed as a result of damage from the hurricane, and it killed them. So there were 4 indirect fatalities from the storm, but during the storm, there were 0. And by March of 2017, we were told that 85% of the damage was resolved, and we're thinking there's no way. Resolved is a key term because resolved doesn't necessarily mean fixed. It means there's a solution for the structure that was damaged. So here is, and it's one more video, I'm sorry, last one. Here is what Baracoa looked like after Hurricane Matthew. And we'll show you some pictures of what it looked like when we were there.
Here's the scene here this morning in Baracoa. Complete destruction.
Era un barrio entero, devastado.
See his
Un barrio entero devastado, mira.
as they swing around. You see a lot of rooftops missing. That mountain or that big hill up there that used to be full of palm trees, and now they're just ripped apart.
That's probably good.
It's a scene of complete destruction here this morning.
So we met with the director of SITMA, who is the organization in charge of running their strategic life task project. And I saw this at the conference and asked him for a copy of the slide. This is the main malecon over here along the seafront, and this is the area that was mostly affected and then partially. And so their strategy is actually to remove homes, residences along here, and just build it with other infrastructure, tourism, daily use, industry, or a variety of other things. So we decided to take a look. This is what Baracoa looked like in July, a year and a half after the hurricane. A lot of it looks like it almost never was damaged, but you can see that there's still quite a few areas that weren't fixed, and these are not occupied anymore, or they're decided eventually to tear them down. So the resolved necessarily not meaning everything's fixed, but they found a different solution for what the previous use was. So Scott and I decided to, at the heat of the day, do a survey along the malecon, which is what it looks like on a regular day here. From the start to the end, this is the baseball stadium here. And we started looking at what was damaged, what was repaired, what was partially repaired, mostly repaired, completely repaired, or completely brand new build. And if you look, besides what's left that's destroyed, 80% of it is habitable or repaired. 80% has been redesigned into something different. So although they said 85% of it has been resolved, we saw about 80%, but those that still remained destroyed, there was other solutions found for those. So here's what some of the reconstruction looks like throughout Baracoa. And this is one of the construction areas where they have a quote from Jose Marti, who's one of their national poet heroes. Basically says this is occasion for greatness. So they're trying to, as they rebuild, make sure that they're doing it right and with the hazards in place. And then here's kind of what it looks like for those places that were destroyed and not rebuilt. So how does Cuba help rebuild when they don't have the resources? They subsidize recovery. They don't have grants. They do have countries that come in and offer aid. Countries that send in rebuilding teams and they'll take donations. Like Germany will send lots of different kitchen sets and things like that. So they do that, but for the homeowners, they subsidize recovery by cutting prices. So this is a sign on a construction warehouse that talks about if your home was damaged from Hurricane Matthew, you don't pay the regular price, you pay the 50% price. So that's the resource that they can offer for their residents. Flood protection, they've dealt with for a long time, and this is just an image of what some of the ways that they protect. Their power and their water is free, but as you can see, codes are interesting. I'm actually not going to talk about the planification process because I couldn't find it in the new Constitution. It could be one of the things that was removed, so you have to forget about that. And then the last video, and we're done. This is our cab ride in a 49 Chevy through Holguin. You can see, here, let me go back. You can see the mode of transportation that's used predominantly by the native population here. Quite a bit more of that. This is a lively place. Really amazing people, really kind. A lot of horses. Access to very few vehicles. Transportation on the coast, but vehicles can get around. So something that we found out, these are a bunch of kids on gadgets. They don't have Wi-Fi there, but they download games and they play them. We're totally different from this. The way that we've grown up, the way we view the world, the creature comforts that we have, but we're not that different actually, if you think about it. So thank you very much for your time. I have like a minute or two. If you have any questions, I'll hang out for a few minutes. If not, feel free to email me, but thank you for taking the time out to listen. I appreciate it.